Welcome, everybody. We're going to give it just a moment to let everybody connect, and then we'll get started. Right. Well, welcome officially. I'm Brandy Breslin. I'm a museum educator here at the Palmer Museum of Art. I'm very pleased to have you join us this evening for our lecture with our special guest, Dr. Jonathan Frederick Waltz, who's here to speak in conjunction with our special exhibition, Field Language, the Painting and Poetry of Warren and Jane Rohrer, which is on view at the museum right now. I'm not going to be on very long. I'm going to shortly turn it over to get the program started, but I do want to let you know that we are recording this. You'll be able to find the recording later on the Palmer's YouTube channel. And I will be here to monitor the Q&A and the chat box. So if you do have questions for our speaker, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A and chat box. And then at the end, we'll have time for that. And anything else? I think that covers all of the bases. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to one of the exhibition curators, Christopher Reed, who's a distinguished professor here at Penn State and also one of the curators of Field Language. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to welcome everybody to the Palmer virtually. And, you know, given that if we were doing this really, we probably would have had to cancel it because Jonathan Waltz would not have been able to fly here and you all would not have been able to drive to the museum. It's wonderful that we could all get together with the miracle of technology. And I'm thrilled to introduce Jonathan Waltz to you. He will help us imagine forms of conversation between Warren Rohrer and the artist Alma Thomas, whose abstract paintings Rohrer admired. I want to mention that one of Thomas's big paintings called Hydrangea's Spring Song will be on view at the Palmer beginning on March 28th as part of the show Mark Makers, Language of Abstraction, which has been curated by Joyce Robinson to accompany our exhibition on the Rohrers as part of a multi-year, multi-institutional partnership formed by the Philadelphia Museum of Art through the Art Bridges Terra Foundation initiative. At this point, I have also been asked to remind you that for the foreseeable future, visitors coming to the Palmer should reserve their free timed ticket entries on the website before arriving. We had, I've just been told, 70 some people at the museum on Saturday, and a few people did have to delay their entry in order to be able to stay in line with the numbers of people who are allocated to be in the gallery. So we're thrilled with our own popularity, but we don't want it to inconvenience you. So please, when you're planning to come to the Palmer, if you could register in advance, it will simplify everybody's life. But now, on to Jonathan Waltz. He has over 25 years of experience in art museums, including more than a decade of service at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and he is currently Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of American Art at the Columbus Museum in Columbus, Georgia. He has curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions. I've picked out some of the ones with the most exciting titles for you. Embodied Black Identities in American Art from the Yale University Art Gallery, Florida's Usable Past, the Sunshine State and the Index of American Design, Land of Enchantment, New Mexico as Cultural Crossroads, and my favorite title, This is a Portrait If I Say So, Identity in American Art, 1912 to Today. Right now, Jonathan is in the early stages of research for a future exhibition, which sounds really fascinating. It is titled From George Catlin to David Hockney, Deaf Artists in the United States. And he is currently co-curating the exhibition Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, which will open at the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia this July, and then travel to 3 other venues. I've known Jonathan for 15 years now, ever since we shared an academic year at the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center in Santa Fe. So I can attest that in addition to his impressive scholarly qualifications, he is an excellent companion, always up for an excursion to go see something new or taste something new, and an excellent conversationalist. So I'm sure we will all enjoy the excursion he has planned for us this evening on the model of an imaginary conversation between Warren Rohr and Alma Thomas. Jonathan?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I see so many friends and acquaintances in the chat or in the participant list. And I'm really thrilled so many people could visit via technology. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that working? And before I get started, I actually wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional land of the Muskogee Creek peoples, past and present. And I want to honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This acknowledgement, which I believe is in the spirit of Warren Rohr and Alma W. Thomas, calls us to commit to learn to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. I thought I would give just like a super quick kind of run through of how I, of all people, happen to be writing about Warren Rohr, because I'm not necessarily the demographic. And so just very briefly, I was born in Baltimore and spent the first decade of my life between Baltimore and Western Maryland. So the idea of Pennsylvania Dutch, and especially the foodways, were completely familiar to me as a child. Shoe fly pie, shout out to shoe fly pie. In high school, I became obsessed with modernist artist Charles Demuth, who is from Lancaster. And then kind of by coincidence, as life happens, in college, I met Rennie McGill, a Mennonite from the Lancaster area. We were roommates for 2 years, and through Rennie, I met his mom, Velma McGill, and Douglas Whitmer, and all three of them are practicing artists. After college, I spent a lot of time in the Washington, D.C. area, and certainly during that time became familiar in a very general way with Alma Thomas and the Washington Color School. New York, of course, visits to museums, visits to galleries, State College. Rennie ended up going to grad school at State College, so I visited him there several times when he was in the MFA program. Douglas and his family ended up in Philadelphia, so I've spent a lot of time in Philadelphia as well. As Chris mentioned, I met him and our friend Libby Bischoff, who is also on here. Hi, Libby, in Santa Fe. And now I'm currently in Columbus, Georgia. So all of these things kind of sort of conspired to have me end up writing about both Warren Rohr and Alma Thomas. And as Chris mentioned, I'm sort of following this model from Miguel Covarrubias, who was a caricaturist for Vanity Fair in the 1930s, and he had a regular column called Impossible Interviews. This is maybe one of the more staid examples, but Covarrubias is always combining two very unlikely persona and kind of imagining a dialogue between the two of them. So here we have Toscanini, the super serious academic, conductor, and S.L. Rothafel, who was very much a populist and very much in the film industry. So kind of a mashup there. What provoked the essay in the catalog that the essay that I wrote for the catalog was this almost kind of throwaway sentence that I had come across in 2002 when I visited the Philadelphia Museum of Art to look at the War and Roar exhibition there. And it's a sentence from the exhibition curator, Susan Rosenberg. She basically makes a kind of formal comparison between Corn Stubble, which is a 1973 painting by Warren Rohr, and she says that he incorporated the teeth of individual brushstrokes as a compositional and structural element, a technique that recalls the work of African-American painting by Alma Thomas, and another nature painter and a modernist painter working outside the Artistic Center of New York in Washington, DC. And I was like, I want to know more. Like, why is this an illustration in a sentence? But like, you know, she didn't really unpack it. And I was always very curious about any kind of possible relationship that there might be there. But, you know, that was in 2002. I didn't really think much about it until field language kind of, you know, came onto my periphery, and I was kind of thinking about maybe something that I could contribute to the project. Very happily, Christopher Reed, in doing his own research and reading through the oral history interview that is at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, realized that there actually was a connection between Alma Thomas and Warren Rohr. He mentions her specifically. He does not know her name, but he says, I saw a painting by a woman painter in Washington. She was, I think, a Black woman who was an art teacher and became a pretty well-known painter in her later years and became an abstract painter. She had been using a brushstroke that would be intermittent, and the brushstroke would represent the positive, and the remnant or leftover part was the negative. I followed her work a while, and during that one period, I was very interested in the fact that there was this rhythm that she established just by lifting the loaded brush. And what I'm showing here on the right is kind of a zoom in on a painting at one of my favorite places, the National Museum of Women in the Arts. This is an Alma Thomas painting called Orion, after the constellation. And I think it's a really good example of where she's drawing a loaded brush very carefully in these rows across the canvas. And she's creating this rhythm through these hyphens that are kind of left over. These white areas are actually the canvas peeking through. And sometimes if she didn't like where she had originally left that hyphen, she would often go back and kind of correct it with red paint and, in this case, white paint. But I think it's a really good example of what kind of attracted Warren Rohr's attention, and something that he kind of was trying to figure out, like how she was dealing with this particular kind of technical problem. It's not like they never met. And that's the first sentence of my essay. They never met, but they were alive at the same time. And they were basically, Warren was kind of more at the beginning of his career, but in a way, Alma was also at the beginning of her career, because she had a second career. She taught public school for 35 years. And then upon retiring, while she had been painting all along, she was able then at retirement to devote time specifically to painting. And so in 1972, as you can see here at the bottom, she had a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. That show and another important show for Alma Thomas, the Contemporary Black Artist in America show, all three of these projects were at the Whitney. And you can see they sandwich that really important quilt show that inspired Warren Rohr and Jane Rohr in their own work. So it's possible they were both at the Whitney at the same time. They just didn't know it. But I was kind of, you know, fascinated from a distance that they were kind of brushing past each other, and yet they never really had a in-person conversation themselves. But what's great about art history is that you can bring things from different time periods, different cultures, different communities together, and compare and see what's similar and what's different. So I'll run through next just a couple of biographical kind of correspondences. Once I started really digging deeper into Warren Rohr's biography, at that point, when I was conceiving the essay, I had spent at that point hours and hours in the Alma Thomas archive at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. So I was very familiar with kind of her life and development. And so it was really interesting to sort of lay Warren Rohr's biography over top of that and watch where there were kind of through lines. One of them is that they were both raised in Christian congregations. And this idea about being set apart isn't specific to Judeo-Christianity. For example, if you think about the Buddhist tradition, monks are set apart for a very special purpose in that religious culture. So it's not necessarily the denominations that they belong to, but they grew up in a Christian context that had this concept of where the clergy were kind of set apart from, you know, lay people. And specifically also for Warren Rohr, his community very intentionally set itself apart as a community from the rest of the world. So this idea of setting apart seemed to be really something that was unifying and also sort of maybe helped explain some of the other kind of correspondences that I was able to find in their lives and their work. So this is actually Alma Thomas's home church in Washington, DC. It was the first African-American parish in the Diocese of Washington in the Episcopal tradition. Another thing that really united them is their childhood experience with rural environments. Of course, Warren Rohr grew up on a farm and then as an adult, like lived around farms. Alma Thomas, as a child, lived in Columbus, Georgia, where I am based now. But at the time, in 1900, there were only 17,000 people in Columbus, whereas now there's 300,000 people. So it was a very different place at that time. And her grandfather, her mom's dad, had quite an extensive estate himself as a free Black person after the Civil War in Alabama, just across the lower Chattahoochee River from Columbus. And Alma and her sisters would spend summers with the grandparents there. She retained very vivid memories as an adult of those experiences. And this is just one example of where, as an adult, she's thinking back to those days along the Chattahoochee River. Another thing that really interested me was how there were both artists really grappled with issues around ability and disability. And both of them, Warren Rohr, as many folks probably know, his grandparents were deaf and one of his brothers was deaf. Alma Thomas, in a written kind of personal statement in an interview, she talks about how she had hearing difficulty when she was small. So there was something there that I found really interesting that kind of lined up. But beyond that, if you think about Warren Rohr later in life and grappling with wanting to keep creating and dealing with leukemia, there's, you know, issues that you have to address if you want to keep working in the studio. The same for Alma Thomas. In 1964, she had a really bad attack of arthritis. She actually was bedridden for almost a year, and she thought she wouldn't ever be able to like do anything again, let alone paint. And somehow she was able to sort of, I think through sheer force of will, she was really a firecracker. She you know, she just wanted to paint so badly that she kind of just made it happen. But she talks about how she could only paint to a certain height uh, because of her arthritis. She couldn't really get up on a ladder like her friend Sam Gilliam could. So, you know, what we found through this research project actually was how she took the cards she was dealt with aging and ailment and really modified her practice to be able to keep painting. So one thing I can point to really easily is that after retirement, she moves from oil paint, which requires more cleanup and is also a little bit heavier, but also takes a longer time to dry. She needs something that works much more quickly. And so she switches to acrylic. And of course, it's much lighter and she's able to layer without the canvas becoming super heavy. And it dries a lot faster too, which was important to her. So ability was really something I found interesting that kind of structured some of the choices that they made. Another thing that really interested me was about access. And this has to do with the communities they found themselves in. Obviously, Warren Rohr didn't really have to deal with racism himself, but Alma was Black, and coming from the Deep South to Washington, DC, DC was still segregated at the time, even though it was a better place for African Americans to live and work than where they had been in the Deep South. So what's important is that Alma very early on knew that she wanted more and she didn't have access to that, but she was going to figure out a way to get access to what she was interested in. And so it's kind of amazing, but her family moves to Washington in 1907. And in 1908, a year later, she's knocking on the door of the Corcoran Gallery of Art and demanding to be admitted. And this is a time when Blacks were not permitted inside the museum. And so it's really remarkable that she was just able through charm and sheer force of will to convince the folks that she should be there. Warren also very much was curious about what's going on in the art world. So as soon as he's able, like goes to college in Virginia and is able to visit National Gallery, other museums in Washington. But it's because of how he grows up that his access to those resources are really limited at the beginning, and he has to sort of navigate or engineer ways to access information about art history, about contemporary art, about what's happening in museums. Same thing for Alma Thomas. Last, in terms of biography, they were both teachers, and I think that's really important when you think about how, you know, there's a big difference between being a university professor and a practicing artist. You are kind of more tied to the academic schedule. You have to really concentrate and work for those, you know, 2 months during the summer. You get sabbaticals, and that's really different from a professional artist who might even have like studio assistants and is able to sort of go to the studio every day, whenever they want. And Thomas talks about how while her family of origin enjoyed a certain kind of privilege as middle-class Blacks, she literally says there wasn't a trust fund. You know, she knew she had to do something so that when she retired, she'd have a retirement. And she glommed onto this idea of being a school teacher. So I actually find this really, you know, I think this is kind of this silent influence in her life and work because she's being exposed as a teacher to what the children are doing in her classrooms. And she's learning, she's kind of keeping up with what's going on in terms of new materials and pedagogy. And similarly, Warren Rohr never really is able to sort of like full-time, like at least at the beginning, he has to like teach to kind of keep food on the table. So that's something that really is common to both of them, and I think has some impact on how they make and what they make. So those are biographical sort of correspondences, and I, in the essay, kind of wanted to think about those in relationship to a lot of formal relationships that happen between the two bodies of work. And I think it's what Susan Rosenberg's kind of getting at in that throwaway sentence from the catalog in 2002. But I was able to like really devote a lot of time to thinking about this. And I came up with a handful of examples that I'll just tab through really quickly. This is actually the painting that Joyce Robinson, curator extraordinaire, assistant director, is engineering to come to visit you all while the War and Roar exhibition is on view. I really am so excited. Like when she told me, it was kind of like my head exploded because it's such a perfect example, and it's actually so good that I used it in the essay actually as an illustration. But there's this moment in both of their careers, like not talking to each other. They both arrive here like from different roads, but get to kind of the same place where they're using sort of letter forms that they've kind of seen in nature, and like kind of translating that experience, or thinking about letter forms in landscape in this kind of very abstract way. Something that comes up again and again in the secondary literature with War and Roar is this relationship to textiles. And if I'm not mistaken, in the show there's some quilts. And so this idea of stitching and kind of bringing things together, but also in a very particular way, is very meaningful for both of them, actually. And War and Roar talks about this relationship between the Amish quilt and the fields that the Amish tended. For Thomas, her mother is a seamstress, and so Columbus is a textile town. The Chattahoochee River provided water power for a slew of textile mills. So this was very much part of her growing up. Of course, cotton was a big cash crop around here. And so her mother's a seamstress. She actually says later in life, Alma does, that her mother's dresses were so beautiful, they were actually like paintings. So she has this very kind of clear idea in her head about the relationship, this visual relationship that kind of bespoke clothing and a handmade object like a painting would have. Actually, Thomas starts at Howard University thinking that she actually is in the home economics department and is determined, like she's decided as a new student at Howard that she's going to become a costume designer. That's kind of her goal. And so like she, again, like this idea of clothing and sewing is very much part of her kind of conceptualization of creativity. So on the left here, we have some costumes that she designed for the Howard Players. And then on the right, we have this amazing dress that she commissioned actually for her solo show at Fisk University in 1971. But it's such an amazing dress. Of course, you have to wear it to your opening at the Whitney in 1972. And if you can imagine, the color scheme here is green and orange and red with those white blocks sort of. So she very much is often mentioned in the like newspaper articles and secondary literature about Thomas, that she would actually often dress up for openings to match her paintings. And so this isn't an exact match at the Whitney, but she's obviously very much thinking about this relationship. something that I thought a lot about, and we had a study day as essayists for the catalog, and I'm really grateful to the organizers of that event and also the funders. Like it was really, I learned so much during that day. And one of the things that kind of crystallized was I was thinking about Alma Thomas and Warren Rohr and their relationship to light and what they're thinking about in terms of light. And I think I even said in the essay something about like, you know, I think it's really interesting that they're both addressing, you know, what it is to paint light. And one of the participants at the study day was like, well, don't all artists kind of deal with that? And like, it kind of caught me off guard. And I thought about it for like weeks and weeks. And I was like, you know, actually, like not all artists really do, you know, like for example, minimalism, not really interested in light. So both of them are really interested in kind of recreating effects or trying to get at certain kinds of incidents that happen out in the natural world and then translating that into paint on canvas. And so this is a really great comparison. Both of them paint pond paintings. Alma talks about how her grandfather's farm had a pond and she would often think about this. So just an example of where both of them are thinking about light, but Thomas also very much often uses broken light. So the color spectrum as light through a prism. She's very interested in weather and very similar to things that Warren Rohr is interested in, like fog and mist. This is from Thomas's show in 1966 at Howard University. And this is where she first comes up with these broken brush marks that she then becomes like super famous for. And why I chose to show this particular painting, other than I love it, because David Driscoll looks so young and like they're both so happy. But it's this painting in the background. Our research for the show indicates that it's called Red Nursery #4. It's one of the first of these images that she used this broken brush mark, and it's only one of 4 that uses them horizontally. And so the point is here that she's thinking about, just like Warren Rohr is thinking about, vegetation and sort of nature in a very broad sense, but they're both thinking about kind of light at time of day, like how light hits different surfaces, but also like plants and the seasons of planting and harvesting and blooming and dying are very much both part of the way that they think and work. Thomas often has kind of seasonal names in her titles. So this is just one example of vegetation. There's a great story that I just want to sidebar. The research for the show, my co-curator did some digging about what Thomas learned in the technical high school that she attended in Washington. And it turns out that the principal of the high school was basically very devoted to drawing as a way to learn. And so basically everything you did like involved drawing. And one of the exercises, I think this is so great, one of the exercises that he would have students do, and this is like younger students, but they would draw basically seeds and ground on paper, and then like, you know, draw the sprouts growing and then the flowers. And so I really think maybe subliminally there's this kind of exercise that maybe she did or knew about in high school kind of behind these nursery flower paintings. Both of them are very smart about art history, you know, that idea of access, like they figured it out eventually. So they're going to museums all the time. The Phillips collection is incredibly important to both of them. Alma Thomas is going to the Whitney, she's going to MoMA, she's going to the Met, she's haunting the National Gallery. And Warren Rohr is also visiting lots of museums. For example, we know he was very much interested in Roger van der Weyden's crucifixion at the Philadelphia Museum. So I just wanted to bring this in as an example of how artists from the second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century were something that like kind of touchstones for these American artists, but they're thinking back into a longer tradition and thinking about how they can take the next step in that tradition. And Thomas specifically talks about this painting as being incredibly influential for her because rather than sketch out the composition with lines, pencil lines or charcoal lines, Cezanne, this is the way he paints, right? He's building up these surfaces through color. And she basically literally says, like, instead of drawing, he creates this architecture out of color that really kind of made me understand how color could structure a painting. She takes it and runs with it. Another example of how they're thinking about tradition, specific artists. On the left, this is Warren Rohr's homage to Piet Mondrian, of course. And if you look very closely at the bottom there, you can see red, yellow, and blue. And then on the right, we have a composition by Emma Thomas. It may seem less familiar, but what she's done is taken Henri Matisse's paper cutout called L'escargot, the snail, and turned it one way and then changed the colors. But basically she's kind of, this is her statement about Matisse. And really it's interesting how she's literally like kind of putting Matisse on his head, right? So both of them very much were thinking about specific artists, but also longer trajectories and traditions. I don't have a slide and I could talk about it, but both these artists were very much influenced by Nicolas de Stael, and the Phillips collection was actually one of the first, if not the first, museum in the US to intentionally collect work by de Stael. So Thomas and Rohr had access pretty early on to work by that particular artist. After all of this kind of compiling of these different kind of correspondences and through lines, as happens, this kind of organizing structure started to well up in my thinking about my essay. And it seemed to me that both artists were really kind of set apart in a way. They sort of chose to be, I mean, Alma Thomas could have lived anywhere and she chose to remain in Washington, DC. And Warren Rohr chose to not live in New York. I mean, he specifically says that he chooses not to go to New York and live there. And so there's kind of this, it's almost like this principled choice that they made to kind of be in contradistinction to what's happening in New York and how important that is. I think I come at this very naturally because as someone who also inhabits margins, and I think part of it has to do with being an introvert, is that if you're the center of attention, everybody knows what you're doing, but if you're off on the side and nobody's paying attention, you can kind of get away with stuff. And I think creatively, that's what both of these artists did. You know, I think if they had to deal with that kind of grind of the New York artist life, you know, it's exhausting. And they were able to figure out how to live a life productively, make amazing work, and they didn't have to deal with that aspect of the art world, right? And they could still access New York. They, you know, Thomas would go on the train all the time up there to museums and whatever. So this idea of borders and fence rows becomes really important to both of them because it's the place where they can kind of most fully express their creativity. This is an awesome example. Here's another nursery painting by Alma Thomas. This one's at my museum. It's actually literally the first time that she uses this broken brush mark. And this painting reproduces really cleanly, but if you look at it in person, you can see how she's really, really figuring things out in this painting. There's a lot of kind of overpainting and different layers. You can see the pencil lines of the rose, which she eventually abandons. But why I chose to show this is because we know specifically that Thomas has a conversation with one of her peers, Jacob Kanan, the artist in DC, about whether the stripes should go all the way to the edge or if there should be a border. And this is obviously something that Warren Rohr is definitely thinking about in paintings like Barley, where he could have continued these marks all the way to either end and all the way to the top and bottom, but he's made this decision to sort of concentrate this activity in the middle of the composition. So borders and fence rows kind of became the kind of overarching way that I was thinking about these particular artists and using all of that other research that I had done to sort of kind of synthesize that and bring it together in a meaningful way. I also think, I mean, again, they didn't really talk to each other, but there are so many interesting ways that they express kind of similar ideas. And Thomas talks about in this statement that's just a personal statement that she wrote that's now in the Archives of American Art. And she talks about how making a picture is two processes. It's a taking in of impressions and a giving out of those impressions by expression. And, you know, it's seeing a subject with your visual and mental eye. And then your task as an artist is to communicate what you see in your inner eye so that other people through your expression can feel and see what you saw and felt. And I don't have a very complete context for this quote, but this is from a dialogue with other Mennonite creatives in 1993 that Warren Rohr participated in. And he's talking about how there's a dialogue between paintings and the artist. And then there's also this other dialogue where there's a dialogue between the painting and the viewer. And I found kind of some correspondences there. I think Rohr would have been very interested in how kind of Thomas encapsulated this way of making, because both of them were really, because of they were creating abstract images, were kind of, their communities were kind of like not really sure what they were doing. Like, what are you making? Like, why doesn't it look like anything we recognize? And I think that's what Thomas is trying to explain here, that she's not going for sort of literal transcription, but she's taking impressions that she herself has received and then trying to recreate that visually so that others can share that experience. Just want to finish up by saying thank you to so many people, Christopher and Joyce and Randy, for setting up this event tonight, and everyone involved with the catalog, Julia Hasdorf, big shout out to her. Basically, in our catalog that's coming out in June, we specifically say that we realized very much through this project, and I think only enhanced by the isolation of COVID, that knowledge and beauty are produced through community. So I just want to say thank you to you all for being here, and thanks to all of the organizers of the Field Language Project. It's such a great interdisciplinary model. I hope that others will sort of take a page from your book and do other projects that are just as interdisciplinary. And of course, I have to give a advertisement to the upcoming show. It opens in July at the Chrysler Museum, and then we'll travel to the Phillips Collection. and then to Nashville, and finally end here in Columbus in summer 2022. So I'm going to stop talking and let people ask questions or make comments.
Lovely. So interesting. I really love the pairing of these two artists and kind of having you walk us through that discovery. It wasn't, even though I'm familiar with Alma Thomas's work and really enjoy whenever I run across it in the museum, it was kind of a surprise for me to see all those connections that you brought out. So thank you for your contributions to that and the catalog in here. Anybody in our audience have any questions to pose for Jonathan, for Chris and Joyce regarding the exhibition?
Can I make a quick little announcement?
Please.
Barley will be coming also from the Philadelphia Museum of Art as part of our Mark Makers exhibition. It has recently been gifted to the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
That's right. That's
right. So we're very, very excited. So you'll get to see, and in fact, we will have them probably very close to one another, Barley and the Alma Thomas. So you really will get to make this comparison. So I'm excited about that.
Lovely. We do have a question, in a couple of questions actually. One in the Q&A from Jennifer, wondering about the exhibition and how many pieces will be in the exhibition, in the traveling portion of the exhibition. I think that's actually about, yes, your Alma Thomas exhibition.
Right. My co-curator and I are terrible, and we just won everything in the show. So it's about 170 objects, but I should qualify that by saying there are a lot of photographs, for example. We're really trying to show more than paintings in the exhibition. So in the 1930s, Thomas was very much involved with marionette making and marionette productions. So we'll have 4 examples of her marionettes in the exhibition. We'll have some family effects from her estate, some of her home furnishings. We're really trying to give a sense of who she was as a person, in addition to her time in the studio. So of course, there's lots and lots of great paintings, but it's not only paintings. So 170 might seem a little deceptive, but we don't intend that. It's just that there's other great material in the exhibition as well.
Nice. And are there any materials in that exhibition that have never been shown before?
Yes. And what's great about this exhibition is that, as happens when you're working on something, like things start coming out of the woodwork. So we've actually managed to, I'm going to say like about 10 works that are not very, like 10 major paintings that are not really well known to the public. Some haven't been on public exhibition before. Some of them were reuniting for the first time probably since that show at Howard in 1966. So lots and lots to enjoy and look at in the exhibition.
Great. Thank you. A question in the chat from Judy. First of all, thanking you. Don't know if you saw that, enjoying the insights, but also commenting that Thomas seems to use color to animate, in quotes, taking form out of time and place. Could you speak more to how she figures out color?
That is so prescient because my long essay in the forthcoming catalog is all about Thomas and motion. And just briefly, motion for, like, color is the vehicle for motion and vice versa. And she's really using both of them to convey her moral sensibility. She really sees modernism as a way to better humanity. That's very important to her. So among other ways, of course, she's using repetition, but she's very interested in color theory. It's very well known in the secondary literature that she is kind of obsessed for a while with Johannes Itten, who taught at the Bauhaus before getting kicked out. But his color theories are kind of compiled and published in English in 1961. And I really think that book becomes her Bible. And of course, he's talking about simultaneous contrast. He's talking about ways to animate compositions through just using color. But she's got a lot of tricks in her toolbox. I'll send you a proof of my essay ahead of the catalog, just because you're super special, Judy. you can get a sneak peek.
Very nice. A couple other questions coming in. Anne asks, did either of them think about Agnes Martin?
I think Rohr did for sure. Yeah, he was aware of her. I don't think that Thomas knew what Agnes Martin was up to. I think she might, she might have seen some examples here and there, but it's not a name that comes up as somebody that she's thinking about. She did, though, collect art books. She frequently says, I want to keep up with what's going on. I have turned away from easel painting and plein air painting, and I want to get on with it. I want to get on with the future. So she definitely, she subscribed to magazines and bought books all the time. So I wouldn't be surprised, if in a general way, and in fact, there's only 4 Thomas paintings in this horizontal format, which is very much Agnes Martin. After these 4, she strictly is either rows up and down or circular forms. So really that kind of formal similarity, she kind of abandons in the early on in the 60s. So by 68, she's kind of fully dedicated to either circular forms or rows up and down.
Nice. We have a couple of hands raised.
Can I just
Chris, do you
dive
wanna
in
go
on
in?
the Agnes Martin issue?
Yep.
So he was indeed asked about Agnes Martin at one point in the long recording that's archived at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And he said about his work from the early 70s, the ones that really look that way, those paintings involving the rose were certainly related to Agnes Martin, but it was not really Agnes Martinesque. I love that phrase, in a sense of the way it looked. He says, I did not deal with strict horizontal or vertical patterns. So there's definitely a sense there that he is in his own virtual conversation with Agnes Martin, but he's also, drawing distinctions between his concerns and her concerns.
Great. All right. Our other hand raised was Wagner, who I have opened up, and he's joined. You can unmute and ask your question, Wagner. Still with us?
Yes, sorry, actually, I don't have a question. My cat stepped on the keyboard.
Oh,
But Jonathan for quite some years now, and I know he's a fellow cat lover. Anyways, I just want to say I'm looking forward to the Alma Thomas exhibition. I was the first person at the Palmer when it opened, and the Warren exhibition actually brought me to tears. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope you can come visit us, Jonathan, sometime in person. And
Yeah.
it's so. Cheers.
Thank you. Great to hear from you, Wagner.
all right. Other questions from Sherman Clark. Will your Thomas exhibition be pretty much the same at each venue?
Yeah, that's a great question. In principle, yes. There's 4 venues. So there's a couple of times where the first 2 venues will have things that are not in the second 2 venues. And vice versa, there might be a few loans that are only the last 2 venues and not the first 2, but it's fairly minimal. I would say those objects are probably less than 10 out of the 170. But what I will say, everyone has to come to Columbus, because if you don't know, the Columbus Museum has a dual mission to collect and interpret and steward objects of regional historical significance and American art. So my counterpart, the curator of history, Rebecca Bush, who is amazing, is going to do a companion show, Columbus only, that really looks at the Canty Thomas family in the Chattahoochee Valley and uses a lot of material that we couldn't shoehorn into our other show. So please, please, please come to the last venue, because there's something in addition to the regular show that you'll get to see, which I think will be really illuminating for folks.
Nice. There was a comment from Douglas Whitmer in our chat, just kind of circling back to that idea of Agnes Martin. And Chris, you might have touched on this a little bit, but just pointing out the anecdote about Warren being affected by the Agnes Martin show. So I wanted to make sure that you brought that in. And it looks like people are ready to get on board to go visit you in Columbus.
Great.
We do have a question from someone in the Q&A. Since Thomas, a generation or two older than Rohr, can you say something revealing about the generational differences between the two?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I touch upon it in the essay. So Thomas is born in 1891, and she does everything backwards and upside down. Like, she has this very willful way of being in the world. So in a way, it's not surprising, but she does not kind of follow the kind of regular or normal way of doing something. So she graduates from high school, gets teaching certified, and then teaches at a settlement house in Wilmington, Delaware for 6 years. And by that time, when she goes back to Washington to attend Howard University, she attends Howard University when she's 30 years old. So she's going to classes with like undergrads who are like 18 and 19, right? So it's almost like she kind of like gets this reset button somehow. And part of it is because she was so invested in classroom teaching that she felt like she had to dedicate herself to that for 35 years. And once she's finished with that commitment, she never stops teaching though. I mean, it's just classroom teaching that she stops. Then she's able to devote much more time to painting in the studio, but she has paid her dues. And that's the important thing that I don't think people get, because she doesn't sort of just spring Athena-like onto the art scene in Washington all of a sudden. Like, while she's teaching, she's very intentional about everything that she does. And a decade before she's getting ready to retire, she starts taking courses at American University. So she's already finished at this point a master's degree in art education at Columbia in 1934. But in the 50s, from 52 to 57, on the weekend and in the evening, she's going to American University and taking art and art history classes. So that's where she really makes this developmental change from painting a literal transcription of reality to something that's abstracted, that's very like still reality, but simplified into geometric shapes, say, and then to this non-objective, like it's just about form. And that's really the crucible years that kind of get overlooked. And, you know, there's not a lot of material from that period, but that's why she's able in 1960 to just kind of hit the ground running. And that show at Howard in 1966 is really more than the show at the Whitney in 72 is important, no doubt about it, but it's really that show in 1966 at Howard that like is the switch. So what I'm trying to say is she has paid her dues all along so that when she has the time and resources, she's able to double down and kind of hit this reset button. And at that point, like when she's at American, she's hanging out with people like Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland, who are younger than she is, but she's treated as a peer. And her age never really kind of makes a difference. It's often remarked upon. She often says, like, I hate hanging out with adults. They're so boring. Like, I want to hang out with young people. She says something like, you know, the older I get, the younger I feel. Like, she really regrets that her body is kind of deteriorating because she has like so many ideas. She wants to get onto canvas. So she really kind of maintains this youthful spirit that allows her to not really seem out of step at that point, even though she's probably like 20 years older than everybody else that she's hanging out with. But because of friendships like Kenneth Noland and Sam Gilliam and Morris Louis, she's able to make those really important networking connections that make all of the difference in showing in the art world.
All right. Wonderful, inspirational too, right? As far as a biography.
Oh my God, she's so optimistic. And we really struggled with the title for the show because so much of what happened in 2020 was not beautiful. It almost seems kind of a little flip to call this exhibition Everything is Beautiful, but her MO was this relentless search for beauty. And I have to say that working on this exhibition during COVID time and during 2020 when everything was so challenging was incredibly inspirational. She is indefatigable. She is just relentlessly looking for the beautiful everywhere and is so wanting to share it. Like, she's so generous too. That's often a comment in the secondary literature is like, oh my gosh, she helped me do this in the art world, or she introduced me to this person that made all the difference. Like, she was always encouraging people. And so I really hope that that energy will continue through the show and kind of other people will be able to access it because she really was an amazing person.
Great. Okay, we're actually at our time right now. Chris, would you like to give a last?
Yes, I want to give a last plug
Note.
because Jonathan has made a couple of references to his essay for us. And now that people have had the opportunity to be in his head for an hour, I'm sure they'll want to read the essay. So that's in the Field Language Catalog, which is available, of course, at the Palmer and through Penn State Press and at a library near you. And Joyce is holding up her copy too. And his essay in there is really beautiful and talks about a kind of bigger history of artists' relationship to the land, about Millets, gleaners, and so forth. And there's also a really lovely essay by Douglas Whitmer, who's been involved in the conversation this evening, the Mennonite artist who Jonathan referenced at the beginning. Another really beautiful essay about Rohr's importance as a teacher and kind of modeling the insider-outsider dynamics that we've been talking about this evening. So there's follow-up if people would like that.
And can I make a plug too? March 3rd, is it 4:30, I think, Brandy? We'll be doing a talk about mark makers. And Joe Margulis and Mary Judge, two of the artists, contemporary artists in the show, will be joining me for conversation. So I will be showing Alma and Warren, you can bet, but that should be fun. So I hope you can join us for that too.
Great. And in the meantime, the Palmer is open. Go online, get your time ticket, come see these beautiful paintings and hear the poetry of the Rohr's, and plan to revisit us when Mark Makers opens. And we'll see you virtually again for Joyce's talk, like she said, on March 3rd. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us tonight and sharing all of this. We look forward to seeing you in Columbus.
Yes, please come visit.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Good night.